The wagon burned long into the night, casting an eerie glow that painted the surrounding wilderness in flickering shades of orange and black. The smell of smoke and scorched wood mingled with the sharp scent of pine and the earth's raw dampness after the afternoon's storm. Evelyn stood a distance away, her small figure framed by the shadows of ancient trees, her breath shallow, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might give her away to the wild things hidden beyond sight. She was 19, but the weight of the past days had carved lines of weariness into her face. The ash clung to her tangled hair, her skirt torn and streaked with mud. And she was alone. Hours earlier, the settlers she'd traveled with had left her behind, left her because they said she was too small, too weak, too slow to survive the arduous journey west. They had abandoned her without a second glance, driven by their own desperation, their fear of falling prey to raiders, storms, or the wild creatures that roamed the plains. Evelyn had pleaded, but her voice had been drowned out by the cracking of whips, the creak of wagon wheels, and the cries of infants. When the last of them disappeared over the rise, she had stood still, frozen by disbelief, until the smoke from their campfire began to fade into the distance. The wilderness around her now felt alive, watching, waiting. The sun had set, and with it went the warmth that had comforted her during the long day's walk. The night brought a chill that seeped through her thin blouse, made her teeth chatter, and her fingers ache as she clutched her mother's locket, a last token of home, of what was lost. The locket's silver surface was tarnished, but inside, the tiny portrait of her mother remained untouched, a reminder of gentler times. The first sounds of night reached her ears, the mournful howl of a wolf far off in the hills, the rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth, the distant hoot of an owl. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She knew she could not stay where she was, exposed and vulnerable. The dying fire of the wagon would attract attention, and not the kind she could afford to meet. She turned from the wreckage and stepped into the deeper woods, where the trees closed around her like a protective wall. With each step, twigs snapped beneath her boots, the sound loud in the silence, but she kept moving, driven by instinct more than plan. Hours passed in a blur of branches tearing at her sleeves and roots tripping her feet. The darkness was near complete beneath the canopy. When at last she stumbled upon a shallow hollow beneath the roots of an ancient oak, she crawled inside, curled herself tightly, and let exhaustion claim her. The dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the trees, chasing away the shadows of night, but not the dread that clung to her. Evelyn awoke shivering, her muscles sore, her stomach gnawing with hunger. She listened, every sense alert for danger. But the world was quiet, save for the soft murmur of a nearby stream and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high above. Gathering her courage, she rose and began to explore, seeking water first. The stream was cold and clear, and she drank deeply, feeling a small measure of strength return. She cupped her hands and splashed the icy water on her face, washing away the ash and grime. The girl who looked back at her in the rippling surface seemed a stranger, hollow-cheeked, wide-eyed, but alive. Food proved harder to find. The wilderness was indifferent to her plight. Berries grew in sparse patches, and she dared not eat those she could not recognize. She found a few wild onions, their sharp scent familiar from her mother's cooking, and chewed them slowly, savoring the meager nourishment. The hunger remained, a constant reminder of how ill-prepared she was for this fight for survival. By midday, the sun had burned away the morning mist, revealing the vastness of the forest and, beyond it, the endless prairie stretching to the horizon. Evelyn climbed a rocky rise and surveyed the world around her. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a sea of grass interrupted by stands of trees, winding streams, and distant hills that seemed to touch the sky. Somewhere out there were the settlers who had abandoned her. Somewhere, perhaps, were those who might help. But there were also dangers beyond counting. As she descended, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of hoof. Panic surged through her. She scrambled for cover, finding it behind a fallen log, heart hammering in her chest. The rider came into view, a lone man, silhouetted against the sky, tall and broad-shouldered, his hair long and dark, his horse lean and restless beneath him. He did not look like the settlers she had known. His buckskins blended with the land, and the bough slung across his back spoke of a different life, one bound to the wilderness rather than fighting against it. Evelyn stayed motionless, scarcely daring to breathe. The rider paused, scanning the land, as if he sensed her presence. For a moment their eyes met, hers wide with fear, his unreadable, dark as storm clouds. And then he moved on, his horse's hooves muffled by the grass, until he vanished from sight. The encounter left Evelyn shaken. Who was he? Friend or foe? Should she have called out? But what if he too meant harm? She could not know. All she knew was that she remained alone, with night drawing nearer once more and no shelter yet found. Determined, she pressed on. The forest gave way to a small clearing where wildflowers grew in reckless profusion, and here she decided to stop. She gathered wood, learning through trial and error how to strike flint and steel to coax a spark into flame. The fire she built was small, hidden, but it gave her warmth, and with warmth came the first fragile feeling of hope. The sun dipped low again, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. Evelyn stared into the flames, thinking of home, of her mother's gentle voice, of the dream she had once had of a life beyond the farm. That life seemed distant now, almost impossible, but as the fire crackled, she vowed that she would not be so easily broken. If the wilderness meant to defeat her, it would have to try harder. The night brought new challenges. The cry of a mountain lion echoed through the trees, closer this time, and the wind carried with it the scent of rain. Evelyn kept the fire alive, feeding it carefully, her eyes heavy with fatigue but her spirit unwilling to surrender. She thought of the rider again, the stranger whose path had crossed hers for a fleeting moment. Was he still near? Could he have been watching even now, hidden by the dark? Sleep claimed her in fitful bursts, broken by strange dreams of wolves with human eyes and forests that whispered her name. And when dawn came at last, pale and cold, she rose with a purpose she had not felt before. She would move west, toward the distant hills where she might find safety or at least a place to stand her ground. Evelyn gathered what little she had, adjusted the locket at her throat, and began to walk once more, the weight of loneliness heavy but no longer crushing. The wilderness would not defeat her. She would find a way to survive. She would endure. And somewhere, unseen, the rider watched from the shadow of the trees, his gaze following the small, determined figure as she disappeared into the vastness of the land. The days blurred into one another as Evelyn pressed deeper into the wild, each sunrise met with cautious hope, each nightfall with dread and exhaustion. The prairie had given way to a broken land of ravines, thorny brush, and jagged outcroppings where the wind howled like a living thing. Hunger gnawed at her belly with increasing cruelty, and her limbs felt heavier with each passing hour. She learned to move silently, listening for the warning cries of birds or the snap of a twig that might signal danger. Every sound seemed magnified in the emptiness, the creak of branches, the whisper of grass, the beating of her own heart. The memory of the rider haunted her. His silhouette burned into her mind, tall, strong, otherworldly in his quiet command of the land. More than once, Evelyn thought she saw him again, a shadow at the edge of her vision, a glint of dark eyes beneath the brim of a weather-worn hat or the glimmer of a bough. But when she turned, there was only the wind and the empty horizon. Still, the sense of being watched never left her. It was not fear that filled her anymore, but a strange comfort. She was no longer sure if she was alone. It was near dusk when her world changed. She had paused at a stream to drink, her lips cracked and dry, her hands trembling from weakness. The water was cold, refreshing, and she lingered too long. The snap of a branch behind her froze her in place. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes wide with terror. Across the water, 3 men emerged from the trees, ragged, filthy, their eyes wild with hunger and cruelty. Bandits. Their weapons were makeshift. A rusted knife, a bent musket, a club carved from a tree limb. But their intentions were clear in their leering grins, and the way they spread out to block her escape. Evelyn stumbled back, her mind racing, her body too weak to run. One of the men spoke, his voice thick with malice. "What's this? A little rabbit all alone?" The others laughed, a sound that turned her blood cold. Desperation gave her strength. She grabbed a broken branch from the ground and brandished it like a spear, though her hands shook so violently she could barely keep her grip. "Stay back," she warned, but her voice trembled, betraying her fear. The leader stepped forward, sneering. "Or what, girl? You'll poke me with that twig?" Before he could take another step, the air was split by the twang of a bowstring. The man's eyes widened in shock as an arrow buried itself deep in his shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. The bandits froze, their heads snapping toward the trees. From the shadows emerged the rider, no longer a fleeting figure, but flesh and blood, towering and grim. The giant Comanche. He was taller than any man Evelyn had ever seen, his broad chest bare beneath a weathered deerskin vest, his arms thick with muscle and marked with scars that spoke of many battles. His black hair fell in waves past his shoulders, a single feather tied behind his ear. His face was impassive, but his dark eyes burned with a fierce light. In his hands he held a longbow, already nocked with a second arrow. The remaining bandits hesitated, torn between fight and flight. The Comanche gave them no chance to choose. The second arrow flew swift and true, striking the man with the musket square in the chest. He fell without a sound. The last of the bandits turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush, his terror plain for all to see. Evelyn stood frozen, the branch slipping from her grasp. The giant warrior strode into the clearing, stopping beside the wounded bandit. With swift efficiency, he retrieved his arrow and ended the man's suffering with a single stroke of his knife. The act was neither cruel nor kind, merely necessary. He cleaned the blade on the man's ragged shirt and turned his gaze to Evelyn. She felt the weight of that gaze as heavy as the sky. He said nothing, but his presence filled the clearing, steady and sure. Slowly, he slung the bow over his shoulder and approached her, his movements fluid, without threat. Evelyn's breath came in short gasps. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to beg him for guidance, but the words lodged in her throat. At last, he stopped a few paces from her. He crouched, picked up the branch she had dropped, and examined it with a faint hint of amusement. Then he broke it over his knee and tossed the pieces aside. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, as if unused to speaking English. Too small for a fight. Too small to scare wolves. Evelyn blinked, unsure if he mocked her or simply stated a fact. I had nothing else," she whispered. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded as if satisfied. "Come," he said simply. And then he turned and began to walk, not looking back. For a heartbeat, she stood rooted, torn between caution and the instinct that told her to follow. But where else could she go? What other choice did she have? She gathered her courage and fell into step behind him. They traveled in silence, the Comanche leading with the sure-footed grace of a man born to the wilderness. He moved as if he were part of the land itself, his every step deliberate and soundless. Evelyn struggled to keep up, her legs weak, her breath ragged, but she refused to fall behind. Night descended swiftly, and with it came the chill of the plains. The giant led her to a hidden hollow beneath an overhang of rock, where a small fire already smoldered, as if he had prepared it in advance. He gestured for her to sit and handed her a strip of dried meat from a pouch at his side. She took it with trembling hands, too hungry to hesitate. The taste was rough, the texture tough, but it filled her belly and eased the edge of her hunger. The Comanche watched in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "Evelyn." She looked up in surprise. "How do you know my name?" "I heard you call it to the wind. Days ago." He shrugged. "I see much." She flushed, embarrassed, remembering the desperate pleas she had cried to the empty prairie. "And you? What do I call you?" He hesitated, then said, Tala? His eyes softened, just a fraction. Means wolf. Evelyn nodded, tasting the name. It suited him. Thank you. For saving me. Tala said nothing, only fed the fire and stared into the flames. The silence stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with things unsaid. The days that followed tested them both. Evelyn learned to read the signs of the land, the broken branches that marked a deer's passing, the cry of a hawk that warned of danger below. Tala taught without words, showing her by example how to move quietly, how to set snares, how to make fire with flint and steel. Slowly, trust began to grow between them, as fragile as a new leaf in spring. They faced dangers together, storms that lashed the land with rain and wind, nights when wolves howled close, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Once, they stumbled upon the fresh tracks of other bandits, and Tala led her in a wide circle to avoid them, his eyes sharp and watchful, his hand never far from his bow. Through it all, Evelyn grew stronger. The girl who had been left behind began to fade, replaced by someone harder, braver. She still dreamed of home, of her mother's voice, but the wilderness no longer seemed so vast, so empty. With Tala beside her, the world seemed, if not safe, then at least navigable. One evening, as they camped on a high bluff overlooking the endless prairie, Evelyn turned to him and spoke the question that had long weighed on her heart. "Why did you help me?" Tala did not answer at once. He stared out at the horizon, where the sun bled red into the land. At last he said, "Because once, long ago, I watched and did nothing, and it cost a life. I will not make that mistake again." His words were few, but they carried the weight of grief, of regret. Evelyn did not press him further. Instead, she sat beside him in silence, watching as the stars began to pierce the darkening sky. The bond between them was no longer that of rescuer and rescued. It was something deeper, forged in blood and fire, in shared hardship and quiet understanding. And though danger still lay ahead, though the road was long and uncertain, Evelyn knew she would not face it alone. The giant Comanche had chosen to stand at her side, and together, they would face whatever trials the wilderness had yet to offer. The dawn broke with a sky streaked in bruised shades of purple and gold, as if the land itself sensed the storm that was about to descend. The prairie that had once seemed endless and empty now felt tight with menace, as though the grass hid eyes and the wind carried whispered threats. Evelyn rose before the sun, her heart pounding with an unease she could not name. Beside her, Tala stood as still as a carved figure, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had barely slept, his senses stretched thin like a bowstring on the verge of breaking. 4 days they had moved with care, following game trails and dry creek beds, avoiding open spaces where riders might see them. But the signs had been growing clearer. Tracks of horses, fires long gone cold, scraps of cloth snagged on thorns, bandits or worse, marauding soldiers who obeyed no law but violence. Evelyn felt it in her bones. The storm was coming, and there would be no more hiding. They came at midday, when the sun burned high and shadows lay short and sharp upon the ground. Evelyn and Tala had taken shelter in a stand of cottonwoods near a shallow ravine, resting for a moment before pressing on. The first warning was the distant thunder of hooves, carried on the wind. Then the cries, harsh, guttural, filled with hunger for blood. Evelyn scrambled to her feet, heart hammering, eyes wide as she saw them crest a distant hill. A dozen riders, ragged and brutal, faces smeared with dust and hate, weapons glinting in the harsh light. Tala did not hesitate. His voice was calm, but urgent. "Down into the ravine. Now." Evelyn obeyed, sliding down the embankment, her hands scraping against the rock and roots. Tala followed, pausing only to uncoil the bow from his back and fit an arrow to the string. They crouched among the twisted roots and boulders, breath held, listening as the riders drew closer. The sound of the horses grew deafening, the ground trembling beneath their fury. But they did not pass by. The bandits fanned out, circling the grove like wolves scenting prey. One dismounted, examining the track. His shout confirmed their fears. The hunt was on. Tala's eyes met Evelyn's, a silent promise passing between them. They would not surrender. They would fight or die trying. The first bandit appeared at the edge of the ravine, musket raised, eyes gleaming with triumph. Tala loosed his arrow, swift as thought, and the man fell backward, his weapon discharged harmlessly into the air. But his cry brought the others, who descended with fury, muskets cracking, blades flashing. What followed was chaos, dust, blood, the clash of steel and the twang of bowstring. Tala moved like the wind, swift and lethal, his arrows finding their marks even as the enemy closed in. Evelyn fought with a knife Tala had given her, slashing at hands that reached for her, dodging blows that could end her life. The world narrowed to survival, each heartbeat a victory, each breath stolen from the jaws of death. But numbers told. For every man who fell, another took his place. Tala's quiver emptied, and he drew his knife, the blade flashing in the sun. He fought with the strength of 10 men, his fury matched only by his skill. Evelyn saw him fall upon one attacker, driving the blade home, then spin to face another, blood streaming from a cut above his brow. Pain burned in Evelyn's side where a musket ball had grazed her, but she pushed it aside, focusing on Tala, on the enemy, on staying alive. The battle raged on, the air thick with smoke and screams. It seemed it would never end. Then, over the rise, came salvation. A small band of Comanche riders, drawn by the noise of the fight, charged down upon the attackers with a terrible cry. Their arrows flew, their lances struck true, and in moments the tide turned. The surviving bandits broke and fled, pursued by the warriors who showed no mercy. When the last of the enemy had fallen or vanished into the distance, the leader of the Comanche dismounted and approached. He was older than Tala, his face lined by sun and battle, his eyes sharp and watchful. He spoke to Tala in their tongue, words that carried weight and meaning. Tala answered, his voice weary but steady. The elder nodded, then turned his gaze upon Evelyn. She met it without flinching, though her body trembled from pain and exhaustion. The warriors tended to the wounded, binding wounds with strips of cloth, sharing water and what little food they carried. Tala refused help for himself until Evelyn's injury was cleaned and bandaged. His hands were gentle despite their size, his touch careful. She looked up at him, seeing not just the warrior, but the man, the protector, the friend, the one who had risked all to keep her safe. As night fell, they camped together. The Comanche spoke little, their faces solemn in the firelight. They knew this fight was but one battle in a larger war, a struggle for survival in a land grown cruel and lawless. Tala sat apart, sharpening his blade, his eyes lost in thought. Evelyn joined him, sitting close, drawing comfort from his presence. "Why do they hate us so?" she asked quietly, not expecting an answer. Tala was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because they are afraid. Of what they do not understand. Of what they cannot control." She nodded, understanding more in that moment than she had in all her years. The world was changing, and those who clung to the old ways or sought power through violence would stop at nothing to bend it to their will. In the days that followed, Evelyn and Tala rode with the Comanche, moving swiftly across the land. They learned of a settlement not far ahead, a place where those seeking freedom had gathered, fortifying themselves against the storm of war. The choice lay before them, to join this new community, to help build something lasting and true, or to continue wandering, forever hunted, forever fighting. Evelyn knew her heart's desire. She had seen enough blood. She longed for peace, for a place to belong. But Tala's path was less certain. The wilderness called to him, as did duty to his people. The bond they shared had grown deep, but could it bridge the gulf between their worlds? One night, as they camped on a high ridge, Evelyn spoke her truth. "I want to go to the settlement. I want to help build something better. Will you come with me?" Tala gazed at the stars, his expression unreadable. At last, he said, "The storm is not over. There will be more blood before there is peace. But I will see you safe. I will fight beside you." Relief and sorrow mingled in her heart. She knew he spoke truly, but she also knew he belonged to the wild in a way she never could. Still, for now, they would face the storm together. The dawn would bring new challenges, new battles. But they would not face them alone. The ridge where they camped overlooked the distant lights of the settlement, flickering like stars fallen to earth. Hope stirred in Evelyn's chest as she stared at them, hope for a future forged not in blood, but in courage, in trust, in the bonds that grew between those willing to fight for freedom. And as the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of trials yet to come, she knew the storm had not broken them. It had made them stronger, ready for whatever lay ahead. The first pale streaks of dawn split the night, casting the world in a soft silver light that hinted at the promise of a new beginning. Evelyn stood on the edge of the settlement, boots planted firmly in the damp earth, watching as the sun's first rays spilled over the distant hills. The battered gates behind her creaked in the wind, the smell of smoke and scorched timber still clinging to the air, remnants of the brutal siege they had survived. Her eyes, once wide with fear, now burned with quiet resolve. She had come to this place seeking safety, a home, but had found that peace was something to be earned, fought for with blood and unyielding spirit. The storm of violence that had swept through the prairie days earlier had left scars on both land and soul. The settlement, hastily fortified with felled trees and mud-packed walls, bore the marks of battle. Shattered fences, blackened beams, graves marked by simple wooden crosses. Yet, amid the ruin, life stirred. Children chased one another through the muddy streets, their laughter a defiant hymn against despair. Women patched roofs and tended to the wounded, while men rebuilt what had been lost, their faces lined but unbroken. Evelyn felt a kinship with these people, bound to them by shared struggle, by the fire of survival that burned brighter than fear. Behind her, Tala approached in silence, as he always did. The giant Comanche moved with a grace that belied his size, each step measured, as if the earth itself welcomed him. His face was shadowed by fatigue, a jagged scar now marking his temple, a souvenir of the battle that had nearly claimed them both. He stopped beside her, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun rose like a promise. "You should rest," Evelyn said softly, though she knew rest was a stranger to him now. His hands bore fresh calluses from rebuilding walls and digging graves, his shoulders heavy with the weight of all he had done, and all he had yet to do. "I will, when it's safe," Tala replied, voice low, steady. He spoke the language of the settlers now with growing ease, his words sparse but sure. His gaze lingered on the land beyond the settlement, where danger still lurked in the form of scattered raiders and the ever-present threat of those who saw freedom as something to be crushed beneath their boots. Evelyn turned to him, studying the lines of his face, the quiet strength in his posture. There was something different in him now, a shift as subtle as the changing of the seasons. The wildness that had once defined him had tempered, shaped by their shared trials, by the bonds formed in the crucible of battle. And yet, the spirit of the land still called to him, a song she feared he might one day answer. The settlement had become a beacon, drawing those displaced by war and greed, offering sanctuary to the lost. But with growth came new challenges, mouths to feed, walls to raise higher, alliances to forge. The people looked to Evelyn, to Tala, as symbols of their hard-won hope. It was a burden neither had sought, but one they bore together. As the morning deepened, a rider approached, dust rising in his wake. The figure, a boy no older than 16, reined in his lathered horse at the gates, eyes wide with urgency. "They're coming," he gasped, pointing back the way he'd come. "A war party. Maybe 20 or more. Bandits or worse." A hush fell over the settlement, the hum of rebuilding replaced by the tense quiet before a storm. Men grabbed rifles, women ushered children to safety. Tala's hand dropped to the hilt of his blade, his jaw tightening. Evelyn felt the familiar rush of fear, tempered now by the steel of experience. She had run before, but no more. This was her home, and she would defend it. "Get everyone inside the walls," she ordered, her voice carrying across the yard. "Ready the defenses. We know how to do this. We've done it before." Tala met her gaze, and in that shared look was a world of unspoken understanding. They had survived together, bled together. Now they would stand together, whatever came. The attackers arrived before noon, crude banners snapping in the wind, their war cries splitting the air. But this time, Evelyn did not cower. She stood atop the wall, rifle in hand, eyes steady. Beside her, Tala loosed arrows with deadly precision, each shot a silent oath. The settlers fought as one, a wall of flesh and iron that would not yield. The battle was fierce, the enemy relentless. Twice they breached the outer barricades, only to be driven back by sheer will and fury. Tala moved through the fray like a force of nature, his blade flashing, his voice raised in the tongue of his ancestors, a song of defiance and freedom. Evelyn fought at his side, each shot fired not in fear, but in defense of the future they dared to dream. Hours passed like minutes, and at last the attackers broke, fleeing into the wild with the settlers' wrath at their heels. When the dust settled, the cost was clear. Fallen friends, wounded comrades, but also victory hard-won, carved into the soil with sweat and sacrifice. As evening cloaked the land, the people gathered to honor the fallen, to tend to the wounded, to give thanks for another day bought with courage. Evelyn stood among them, exhausted, bloodied, but unbowed. Tala was at her side, his arm across her shoulders, his touch a silent promise. They spoke little that night, words unnecessary beneath the stars that bore witness to all they had endured. Evelyn knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more battles, more trials. But the settlement would endure. It would grow. And perhaps, one day, the prairie would know peace. In the days that followed, the settlement transformed. Walls rose stronger, fields were planted, homes rebuilt. Travelers arrived with news of distant conflicts, of hope flickering in far-off places. Evelyn found herself at the heart of it all, a leader born not of ambition, but of necessity. She listened, learned, guided. The girl once cast aside for her size, for her softness, now stood tall, a pillar of strength in a world reborn from ashes. Tala remained, his bond with Evelyn deepening, his place among the settlers secure. But in his eyes, the horizon always called. He would walk beside her as long as he could, but the wild was in his blood, the freedom of the open land a part of his soul. One morning, as they stood together watching the sun rise over fields green with promise, Evelyn spoke what was in her heart. "You've given me more than I ever dreamed. A home, a future. But if the time comes when you must go, I'll understand." Tala's hand found hers, rough and warm. "Where you are, is where I belong. For as long as I am able." And in that moment, with the prairie stretching endless before them, the wind carrying the scent of new life, Evelyn knew the truth. The dawn of a new life was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of something greater, a world they would build together, stone by stone, heart by heart, until the land itself remembered what it meant to be free.